Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is really cool to talk about, and it's symbolically important because there were slaves who were being taken to freedom, right? And how the Underground Railroad work? By the way, I don't know if this will ever be on the test. It's a little bit pop history, but how were they freed?
They
Got to the north.
Good job.
Yeah, it was kind of an informal patchwork of houses that participated. They had symbols, like they would have a light on at certain times or wherever, and they would hold slaves. And Harriet Tubman was probably the most famous engineer of the railroad. We talked about that before, right? She carried a gun with her that either she was making it or dying. Those are the two things that was happening. But tell me why this was particularly loathsome to the South. Yeah, but it's also being celebrated by the North. Remember, slavery, whether they liked it or not, was part of the constitutional compromises. And there were fugitive slave laws. In the late 1790s, there were fugitive slave laws that were passed. What do the fugitive slave laws sound like?
It sounds like if you are a fugitive and they found out, you have to send them back.
That, yeah, you are under, just like it is, right? If you are under, or you're prohibited, I should say, from knowing where a slave is and not reporting it. If you see a slave in the North, you are to report the whereabouts of that slave so the slave can be detained and taken back to its rightful owner. As the time went on to the Great Awakening and the religious hatred of slavery, how do you think those laws were seen? Well, first of all, they were ignored. And second of all, they were seen as maybe the most ghastly thing. Because these Northerners had to, on some level, participate in the slave system. Does that make sense? They were asked to be part of this horrible system. And so they pretty much just went ignored. In fact, Pennsylvania came up with a law. Pennsylvania wrote a law that will end up being challenged in court. And it prohibited, in Pennsylvania passed a law that prohibited returning freed slaves. And the South was furious about this. Slave owners, I should say, were furious about this. This is an example of a state formally passing laws that went against a federal Fugitive Slave Act. In fact, this was challenged in court. You have it there. You see where it says Prigg versus Pennsylvania? In Prigg versus Pennsylvania, just call it Prigg. By the way, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a guy named Roger Taney. Does anyone want to tell me why we know Roger Taney already? You'll get whole milk or Cuddles, or Hugsy, whatever his name is. We have talked about him briefly before.
What was his last name?
Taney. He was involved in the banking crisis with Jackson.
He was
he was the
bus
driver.
Nope, that's
No.
Biddle. This guy was against the bus. This guy was Jackson's Secretary of Treasury who helped take the money out. He was the one in charge of taking the money out of the bus.
And he distributed them to like.
Yes. He is a Jackson guy. He's also a slave owner. Very, very, very pro-slave. How do you think he sided in Prigg versus Pennsylvania?
With the South.
Prigg.
His majority opinion was with Prigg, and it made the Pennsylvania law unconstitutional. It declared the state law of Pennsylvania to be unconstitutional. Therefore, what do people in Pennsylvania have to do?
Send them back.
Abide by the fugitive slave law, right? Return slaves. So in response to this, in the North, personal liberty laws began to be passed, right? In response, personal liberty laws were passed. And what these are you did not have to assist anyone looking for slaves. So when slave owners, they would oftentimes hire slave catchers to go and find slaves in the North, you were prohibited from having to help them. You did not have to help these people. Essentially, what could you do to the fugitive slave law?
Shut the door on them.
You could ignore it, right? essentially they're saying you could ignore it. And this drove the South crazy because this was supposedly federal and substantiated law, and the South was choosing, the North was choosing to ignore it. And so by 1850, the Northerners are getting really upset. Prigg was in 1842, and by 1850, Southerners are demanding a much stricter fugitive slave law. They're beginning to demand that this be reconciled. And this is moving into the same issue where California wants to enter as a state. And so what happens is we're moving towards the Compromise of 1850. Before we actually get into what goes into the Compromise of 1850, let's talk about our three senators that we've talked about forever. We have our Northern Senator, our Western Senator, and our Southern Senator. That's not an S. Southern Senator. Cassidy's face. Who's our Northern Senator?
Webster.
Who represents the ideas of the North?
Webster.
Webster, right? We have Daniel Webster. Webster. All right. Who's our Western Senator?
Clay.
Henry Clay. Who, by the way, beat Tate Creek 2-3, 3-2 the other day.
I saw that on the KJA.
Yeah, Henry Clay's good. They have a really good Division I player. Kendall Behrman. Have you seen her play yet?
Yeah, she plays at one.
Oh,
I
does she?
haven't seen her play, but Bailey was talked about.
Yeah, she's pretty good.
Yeah.
And who's our Southern Senator?
Calhoun.
Calhoun. So, this is Calhoun trying to convince the Southern Senators to compromise. Who's in charge of convincing the Northern Senators to compromise? Webster is. And so, in this really famous speech, it's called the 7th of March speech, he is going to try to convince Northern Whigs, eventually they'll be Republicans, to go along with the new fugitive slave law. And this, he was able to convince people, and they went along with it, but he sort of lost his reputation for being moral, right? I mean, he was seen as an appeaser to the South. This is one of the problems you get when you compromise, is that there are hardliners who will consider you a traitor, right? Don't many Tea Partiers think that a lot of Republicans are traitors? And this is the problem with compromise, is that you're going to lose some friends. By the way, all three of these guys would be dead within a few years after the Compromise of 1850. I mean, many of them were very sick. Calhoun specifically was really sick. And the North is getting a new senator, a guy named William Seward. Has anyone heard of William Seward before? Has anyone seen the movie Lincoln? William Seward, he was sort of he was nicknamed Higher Law Seward because he always liked to speak for God in his, sort of moralistic stances against slavery. He ran for president in 1860 as a Republican and probably was the guy to beat. And somehow, we'll get to this, Lincoln beat him. And then Lincoln took most of the rivals that he had just beaten and put them on his cabinet. He ended up being Secretary of State under Lincoln. And eventually, he and Lincoln became very, very good friends. And he became a big advisor to Lincoln. And later said he was happy Lincoln became the president because Lincoln was more qualified. And when Lincoln was assassinated, there was also an assassination attempt on William Seward. In fact, the guy got him. He had a knife and went across his face, and his cheek was left flapping. If you see pictures of William Seward later, he's got a big scar right here. Later, William Seward, as Secretary of State, would do something that earned him, that people said he was about the dumbest Secretary of State ever for a decision that he made. Guess what he bought for $7.2 million? It was told that he was very stupid. Alaska. Have we gotten more than $7.2 million out of Alaska?
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the oil pipelines might have helped a little bit. If nothing else, we got Sarah Palin. Right? $7.2 million of love for conservatives and good jokes for Saturday Night Live. Right?
For real. She wrote some good jokes.
Tina Fey made a living off of Alaska. You betcha.
And Eminem.
Do what?
And Eminem. Eminem has a music video.
About Sarah Palin?
Well, it's like she's in it.
Really?
Yeah. So stupid.
Interessante.
Apparently Saturday Night Live also made fun of Obama's healthcare plan.
They make fun of everything.
Exactly.
Not as,
It even.
They make fun of everything.
they make fun of everything. Faith always looking for it.
Caleb is funny.
But they make fun of other people you like too, Mr. Sayre. Okay, so now the problem was the president was Zachary Taylor, and he did not want to give in the South. He did not want to give in the fugitive slave law, and it looked like this compromise wasn't going to happen, and there was a possibility of war. And then something happened. What happens to all Whigs who are former war heroes, and they become president? They die in office. And he got cholera, and he died. So the Whigs had two presidents, both of whom were former generals, both of whom were not politically very active before that. In fact, there's some evidence that Zachary Taylor hadn't voted in an election before he became president. And he died in office. And so now Millard Fillmore becomes the new president and will pass and sign off on the Compromise of 1850. And let me go over the specifics of the compromise, and then we'll talk about it and then get going. I'd like to get to Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is just fantastically important. Like this, I mean, the stuff we're talking about now is just huge. You'll see this stuff all over the AP exam. You're going to see, I'll almost guarantee you see a Kansas-Nebraska question, at least one, on the exam. The road to the Civil War, you're going to see a bunch of multiple choice questions on the road to the Civil War. Okay, let's go on the Compromise of 1850. Number one, what state wanted to enter as a free state? California comes as a free state. So is this good for the North or South?
North.
North. There are 5 parts, 4 of them are particularly important. Number 2, the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is outlawed. They actually outlawed the slave trade in D.C. It was our country's capital, and this was symbolically really important.